So, what is this, 4? So I woke up today. This chair, I love how creaky it is. Anyway, I woke up today after spending 2 hours trying to figure out how to talk about extreme individualism and making no headway, feeling very constipated on the subject today. I saw that Israel is threatening or approaching or whatever an illiberal democracy with whatever is going on with their Supreme Court. And I listened to some of an interview trying to explain this, and I realized that I didn't actually care enough to try to hold it all in my mind. Once they explained that Israel doesn't have a constitution, I just kind of closed the book of my interest. Well, no wonder that's so much of a shit show. So anyway, it got me to thinking when I saw or heard this person say, I don't remember which is true, that the plan right now, or the goal right now as far as the executive branch of their government, is to become an illiberal democracy. That got me wondering about the definitions of words and what words mean and whether the things that we say have any meaning. What is an unfree democracy? What does that mean? How is that not a contradiction in terms? And I don't have an answer. I didn't press record on this because I had an answer. I pressed record on this because I was tired of listening to myself talk about things that I already knew I'd talked about, if that makes any kind of sense. So, a liberal democracy is a democracy by its by implication. It's a democracy by implication that's liberal or therefore free of the church. And so I suppose that means that it's a democracy that the government itself is a body. If the idea of democracy is a thing, and the government is that thing, then the government if it can be described as liberal, is free of the church. So it's free of the institutionalized religion. Okay then, so does that mean that an illiberal democracy is a democracy that isn't free of the institutionalized religion? And so then the question that I have becomes like, I'm surprised that Israel's government is separated from its institutionalized religion. Wasn't Israel as a country formed specifically to give the institutionalized Jewish religion a nation state to call home? So that had me all confused, and that probably set the timbre for why I can't seem to hold a thought in my head today. Is are we really I guess I don't even know how to talk about this. I don't even know how to talk about what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling. It seems to me like to what end do we care? We, the rest of the world, to what end are we surprised? And I suppose that that what I'm thinking about with this, and what I'm thinking about with observing that people should care, people do have an opinion. I suppose that what I'm doing is I'm appreciating, and by appreciating I don't mean giving thanks for. I mean I'm adequately or accurately applying or assigning value to the fact that I didn't really give a sliding scale of what like individualism and collectivism actually look like, and I never gave extreme individualism its inverse. I never negatively defined it. So I guess its inverse would be extreme collectivism, which I suppose would be like institutionalized Marxism, but I don't think that that's right, because Marx was just an idiot. He wasn't a collectivist. He was just an idiot. He was just a stupid person, and like a stupid person doesn't deserve to have an ist at the end of their name or an ism attached to them. But I assume that other people watch that movie Idiocracy, and that, I guess, I keep coming and understanding the theses of what I'm saying, an episode or two later. But what I was trying to say is that we have institutions because we assume that other people have the answers, and because we have institutions because we assume that other people have the answers, and we developed institution because we came to the conclusion or came to the assumption that institution can have a longer memory than human life. So these people have the answer, these people are part of an institution, and that institution maintains the answer into perpetuity. And that's how I said that you can have institutions and organizations, and you can have social pockets of hierarchy that are permanent. And so I came to a point, as I was talking yesterday, that I was running up on this idea that, where we're really at is that these permanent pockets are really who are attacking one another. You attack what's closest to you, you attack what's most adjacent to you. And so these things that are in the class of permanence are actually what's fighting. And so I guess that's probably where I'm thinking about today, where I'm thinking about like a Jewish state that's not also a theocracy. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, why do they have a nation state, but then why did they not model it after the theocratic nation state that was in that place and had that name, Israel? I don't understand any of that. Like, okay, and the reason that I don't understand it is because of my gross ignorance. Not because I assumed that other people knew, but because I assumed that it would make sense, that they would have done it in a way that makes sense. So what you're telling me is that they didn't recreate the ancient nation state of Israel, but they also didn't make Israel, which was created in like the 1950s, they didn't make it a modern nation state either, so it doesn't have a constitution. So is it just an oral tradition? Like, my understanding is what they were trying to do is they were trying to basically undercut the judicial branch so that the judicial branch didn't have any oversight over executive and legislative decisions. But if you don't have a constitution, you don't have a checks and balances system like what the United States employs, what does it matter? I couldn't mine that data out of what was being said. I couldn't understand why we were being alarmed that Israeli is moving to establish a king. Yeah. Isn't that why we gave them a nation state? Did we not read the Bible? Did we not clearly read what the Israeli nation state is? Or was the whole point to do it in secret so that the book of Revelations could come true in the way that they were written in the early centuries of the early Christian era? If that's the case, no wonder the Middle East is permanently in turmoil. That was the design. It makes me angry. And so that anger, I want to point out to you, isn't at you, and it's most certainly not at Jews as such. That anger is with the British Empire, because it's the British Empire's fault that the Middle East is the way that the Middle East is. In fact, it's a woman's fault within the British Empire that the Middle East is the way it is, because she was in love with the Gilgamesh stories, and she insisted that the modern nation state should be built in the way that they were in the third millennium BC, which is the behavior of a stupid person. But you can be stupid and make decisions for millions of people when you're an extremely wealthy white woman who knows people in the British Empire in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, you can be Lawrence of Arabia back then. You don't have to be you don't have to be yourself independently wealthy. All you have to have is a niche interest. And so in a lot of ways, I think that that's sort of what I'm thinking about too, is I've been thinking about this extreme individualism, and I've been thinking about a sliding scale toward collectivism, but I've also been thinking about artifice, and I've been thinking about, skill. But I don't think I've been doing it in a lingual sort of way. I've been doing it, I think, in a pre-lingual, which I guess a lot of people would call a subconscious way. But I tend to be aware of my thoughts as they come across my dashboard. My day today was mostly spent noticing other theo and philosophers, other people interested in philosophy and theology. What is philology then? Is philology like the study of pair bonding? Anyway, of friendships. I've noticed other philosophers and theologers and people interested in the things that I'm interested in. I've noticed them I've noticed them approaching some of the conclusions that I've come to, or noticing some of the phenomena that I've noticed, and turning their eyes away to not speak to their communities about them. And so I've upset a few religious and philosophical YouTubers and Twitter personalities by asking questions that they didn't have answers for, or that they didn't like the implications of the answers to. And I don't really want to get into it. This isn't really my diary. I mean, I am talking to myself and I am thinking about it. So like I asked a rabbi and Kabbalistic mystic a few months ago if it's not obvious to him, as from the perspective that he's sitting at as a Kabbalist and as a person who's interested in magic. I asked him if it's not obvious to him that Paul was a part of a Jewish secret society, and that Jewish secret society very much co-opted and took over the image of Jesus and the idea of Christianity. And, he didn't respond to that, but then he did respond to another question that I asked him about the oral and written traditions. So he was suggesting that he had found something that was interesting and novel to him in a philosopher that suggested that the literary tradition is one of isolation, and that the oral tradition is one of community and togetherness. And I could tell that he was really grappling with that and really struggling. And so, I pointed out what is true, that, I am also exploring that in my own work, because I do believe that that's what these first three, and in fact now this fourth episode of Talking to Myself have ultimately been about, is about how the literary written traditions are about binding rules into place. I said that magic, especially men's magic, is the literary grammar of it's literary, but it's the mathematics of proper behavior, but it's written down. You write down these things because you can pass down written things unchanged. That's the whole point. And this rabbi responded to me that the oral tradition can be very strict in its rules, but that assumption, that claim to be exceptional is only true in an Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of way about one people. And it's only true if you assume that the text of the Hebrew Bible is verbatim what was written down or what was spoken. But that can only be said to be true if you are a fundamentalist and you ignore archaeological and I believe they would say criticological evidence. So, literary critique, literary scholarship has made it pretty abundantly clear that the Bible in its oldest forms probably didn't actually exist before the Babylonian exilic period. The things that were written down weren't in the oral tradition. That's why they were written down. Sure, you memorized it and you spoke it orally, but it's literary now. It's written down. It's not a part of the oral tradition. If there is a rule, and so what I said is that the exception proves the rule. And so if this people wants to hold themselves apart and say that we're exceptional because we memorize a written text, therefore we hybridize the literary and oral traditions, they're lying. Or their words don't mean anything. The definitions of their words have no meaning. And any tradition whose words have no meaning, any language, I've already said this. Any language whose words have no meaning is a dead language. It's dead in the crib, effectively. But Hebrew's been dead since the 4th century. Hebrew died and disappeared and came back in the 19th century, people. Let's be real with ourselves. This isn't a call to abandon Judaism or to abandon the Abrahamic faiths or to say anything about anything. It's to point out that I have been thinking about the effect that I have on teachers and what that means. Because I had this effect on my teachers in high school too. I remember in 9/11. I was a freshman. A lot of people have been sharing their 9/11 stories in the last few months. I guess September is approaching, isn't it? So it has been 22 years or whatever. So anyway, I was a freshman, and it happened. The first plane struck the first tower before I was actually in my social studies class, but that was my first period of the day, so it must have happened during homeroom while we were taking attendance, because by the time I got to my social studies class, it was already on the news in the class. Like, it had already happened. It was already on the news, and we watched the news every morning for the first 5 or 10 minutes of social studies anyway, so we would have been watching it anyway, but that's all we did for the next week. Definitely for the next, I don't remember leaving that class. I had to have. We had to have moved on with our day and done other things, but I don't remember. I remember seeing the second plane hit, and I remember thinking that we were being deep faked by the news in a sort of, not the day the world stood still. What's the, I can't remember his name either. Orson Welles, is that it? Why can't I remember? Anyway, that radio show. The book was by the guy that did the Time Machine, right? Is that right? I can't remember what that book is called. That's really terrible. Anyway, my brain is fried. I'm thinking about a lot of things. If this audio record isn't evidence of that. But yeah, I can remember I mentioned how in high school, up through high school, but how in high school we had to do the newspaper, had to clip an article out of the newspaper and write a little summary about it, a little report about it or whatever. And I remember we were having because what I'm talking about is how I have an effect on teachers, and teachers tend to lash out at me for my questions. I remember the teacher was talking about bin Laden, how bin Laden had done 9/11 and yada yada, and I asked, I was like, well, isn't it possible that just that bin Laden is taking credit, like that bin Laden is happy to take the credit for it because we can't retaliate against him, so he's just happy to claim something that he didn't actually do, and the people that did this are just going to get away with it. And she told me I wasn't allowed to talk in class anymore. And I remember I would have been in second grade. She asked me why I stopped turning in homework and why I didn't do any of my why I turned in tests blank. She had the audacity to ask me that after the end of the year. Well, you told me not to participate in class, so I figured I didn't need an education from you. Just kept that part to myself. Anyway, I didn't say anything when she asked me that. In second grade, I can remember, it wasn't second grade, it was first grade. In first grade, all that I wanted to be was a paleontologist, right? That's all every first grader wants to be, is to dig up dinosaurs. And my teacher told me that all of the dinosaurs had already been dug up, that there were no more dinosaurs to find, there was nothing more to learn about the dinosaurs, and that I needed to learn the difference in a B and a D. That was the most important thing for me. And I remember thinking, well, if we already know everything, if all of the dinosaurs have already been dug up, and all of the cities have already been dug up, and we've already translated all of the language, and we've already read all of the books, and we already know everything that there is to know, why does it matter whether I can tell the difference in a lowercase b and a lowercase d? Everyone already knows everything. And so anyway, I'm not here to pat myself on the back. I'm here to try to understand, just talking to myself and sharing my sadness, I suppose, is what I'm doing. And I'm not allowed to watch. It's not that I'm not allowed, it's that there's nothing for me to find there from these teachers anymore. So going, and I think that they know that. I think that in their way they're encouraging me to fuck off, because I make their lives more difficult. And so maybe what I should talk about is sophistry. Because it's not the teacher's fault. It's not the sophist's fault that the sophist is a sophist. And not a philosopher. But Plato disagreed. Plato thought that being a sophist was a particular kind of sin. It was a particular kind of missing the mark. And so I've used that term sin, like you also listen to Jordan Peterson and study comparative mythology and care about language. Sin is a word that it seems like it has no definition in the way that we use it. So like when you hear you hear a religious person say sin, it just seems like anything bad, or it seems like just anything. Everything you do is a sin in a way. But the word sin, it comes from two places that got tangled up in one another in the Semitic language. But the first place doesn't really have anything to do with the Semitic languages. It has everything to do with the Indo-European languages, and in the Indo-European languages, to sin is to miss. It's literally just to miss a mark with, specifically an arrow, with a projectile. But there's also this mythological character, Sin, who is in some way an underworld figure, sort of like Persephone's wife, not Persephone's wife, Hades' wife, Persephone, when she's embodying her winter guise. It's not exactly that, but I don't want to talk about that because I don't want to do comparative mythology all the time. As much as I love it, it is it's tedious and pretentious, because ultimately it doesn't matter. You're talking about the same things, and so it's very easy to say, oh, this is that, that's what syncretism is, that's what Hellenism is saying, oh, these different religions are all these different things. I mean, that's how I was able to go on a whole tangent about Hermes Trismegistus. And I'm talking about magic again. And I'm still not talking about anything. So what am I talking about? It's like I finally figure out what I'm talking about, and then I think of 3 different things that I've forgotten to talk about, and then I forget about what I was talking about. So sin is what I'm talking about. And so if sin means to err. It means to make a mistake. And sin, that mistake can be anything minor. Anything as minor as, forgetting to brush your hair, to, the very worst possible things, the blasphemies that cause the wasteland, that cause the rivers to dry up, or the treacheries that governments commit against their people, that kings commit, not repaying their debts to their lords, for example, or using their soldiery on their citizens when their citizens just wanted to be fed, or, betrayals of the king. And these things, like, they're all the same word, they're all, sin, they're all misdemeanor in that way. And some sins are crimes, and some sins are misdemeanors, and some sins some people don't even think are sins, and some people think are the worst kinds of sins. So what does that have to do with anything? I'm not sure it has anything to do with anything, really, but it's something that needs to be said because you just don't hear it talked about. So, what does it mean then to be a liberal democracy? And is that something to aspire to? Is there not another way to effectively govern a people than liberal democracy? So I know that I did it. I think I did it. I don't know that I did it adequately, so let's just revisit it. A liberal democracy is a democracy that's free of the institutionalized religion. And so that makes me wonder if we've talked about the tripartite nature of civilization. And I don't think I have. And so I think that there's a philosopher that's talked about this. I believe that there's a guy who had a triangle. He believed that everything was triangles, and he was all Foucault, I believe, was interested in power, and he was interested in triangles, trifectas. And so we can do some basic math right now, and we can talk about some basic truths. And so people like me, we tend to have an interest in the Fibonacci sequence. That sequence, which is I don't really know where it came from or where it is, but it's a mathematical sequence where the next number in the sequence is the product of the previous number and the number before it. So I guess Fibonacci is a scientist. I believe he was a Renaissance thinker. He might have been before, he might have been after, I'm not sure. But I guess he noticed in nature that when you start with 0 and then you want to go with that sequence, what you get is you get 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, etc. And so something that I have noticed, and I talked about hypotheses and I talked about theorems. Something that I've been testing is a mathematics of religion, a mathematics of mythology, and a mathematics of totem poles, effectively, of worldview totem poles. And so any worldview that doesn't follow the Fibonacci sequence, that doesn't have nothing and then one thing which makes another one thing and then one thing which becomes two things which becomes three, if it doesn't have that sequence, the 1, 1, 2, 3, and a fairly obvious abstraction, it doesn't work. It just can't work. That's something that I've noticed. If it can't work up and then down in that as above so below maxim, in the same way that Newtonian and quantum physics work, up and then down and then back up and then back down. And I don't really know what I'm talking about this, but let's talk about triangles. The reason that triangles work is that triangles are that fourth step. And this is a lot of numerology, and I don't really want to explain numerology, but fours in numerology are pretty significant. The idea of a 4, like the idea of a square, it's like the idea of wholeness, I believe. I'm probably speaking out my ass. But anyway, fourth steps matter because the fourth step is the first step after the pattern has established itself. And so what I mean by that is that I also have a maxim that I've worked out. I don't know if I've heard anyone else say this. I don't know if I picked it up somewhere, but it's a truism that I hold, that 1 time is a phenomena, 2 times is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. So the fourth is the first step after the pattern has been established. So if you're talking about squares, the next time you hit a right angle, it's always going to be a square. And so triangles, there isn't so much a third step. And that's the point. So 3s are wholeness or something. Three is supposed to be like enclosure, I believe, in numerology. I don't really understand numerology well enough to hold the definitions in my mind. So if I'm wrong, hit me up in the comments. Maybe we can have a conversation about it and you can help me understand better. One, 1, 2, 3. So triangles. We've talked previously, like I'm talking to someone. I've talked previously about trifectas. So trinities is how they tend to be called. So, the Trinity that we all know and that we all recognize, because it's really hard to not know anything about Christianity, is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it's really easy to look at that and think that there's no representation of the divine or the sacred feminine. I've actually heard I've actually heard really, really smart, really well-educated people just miss this, just whiff on it, and just not understand. The Holy Spirit is the divine feminine, folks. Just, there's no need to hold your breath. There's no need to even shift your worldview all that much. The Holy Spirit is the divine feminine. And that's just all there is to that. You can't have a father and a son without a mother, and the Holy Spirit is itself a trifecta: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The spirit of life is Eve, is woman. And we've talked about this. It's three schools: the schools of young men, the schools of women, and the schools of old men. And that's what you've got when you're looking at the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so here in the United States, we are also built around trifectas. We love triangles in the United States, whether you know it or not. We especially love those interlocking triangles that become that six-sided star, that's known as the Star of David. And there's a reason for that. The interlocking triangles that become the Star of David, that six-pointed star, that's the most ancient representation of the psychosexual drama. I'm not kidding. So the trifecta that I know you're all thinking about is the judicial, the executive, and the legislative branches of our government. But I believe, if I've listened to people talk about Foucault, because I haven't studied Foucault myself, if I've listened to them accurately, Foucault's triangle was the triangle that I want to introduce, the triangle that I came up independently of him because I haven't read him. The trifecta that makes civilization work as we understand it is the religious, the secular, and the people. Right. So you've got the religious, you've got the ruling secular elite, and then you've got everyone else. Everyone else. And so it is exactly, but I can't remember the name of the principle or whatever, but it's exactly the 80-20, the 80-20 rule. So the 80-20 rule is a mathematical principle that dictates reality, really, that says that, I believe that the way it goes is that 80% of outcomes are dictated by 20% of the participants. 20% of the actors. So if you're interested in the NFL, that would basically say that 80% of football games are, that 80% of wins are the result of 20% of the plays in the game. And if you listen to people like Bill Belichick talk, they'll tell you that it's only 4 or 5 plays that dominate or that determine the outcome of a game. I mean, it's as many as 6 plays that can determine the outcome of a game. When you're talking about each team running 60 offensive plays, that's almost 20%. It's 10, but it's closer to 5. But that 6 number is also arbitrary and untrue. So, oh my goodness, I have like this massive cramp in my shoulder that is just not working out. And it's distracting me from what I'm talking about. So, why does it matter that the religious and the secular are only maybe 10% individually, so 20% combined of the population and of the power of the will of the people. It's hard to say. It's hard to say explicitly. The way that I phrased the question answers it, if you've been paying attention. But because I haven't given a basic definition of the word "the will," or I guess that's a phrase, but whatever. Since I haven't given a definition of will, it's hard for you to answer the question. So let's talk about will. And not will I am. Will is a verb, but it's also a noun. To will something is a sort of mindset. It's a sort of thinking. So to will something is to determine that something is going to happen and then to act accordingly. So when we were talking, I believe it was last time, episode 3, about the secret is directing your will. And so your will doesn't have to be an active, conscious thing. It can be an unconscious thing. And your will is not your want. And this isn't the time and the place, but another thing that I've been distracted and obsessed with is the word want. Because the way that we define and use the word want, as in like I want a hamburger, is not what that word means. And in fact, the way we use that word doesn't exist in English. What we mean doesn't exist. And I'm not sure it exists in any language. And it most certainly doesn't exist in language that doesn't have extreme negative moral connotations. So what we actually say when we say I want something is we covet something, and we all know that that is one of the things that you're not supposed to do if you're an already enlightened person. But to will is something that if you're an enlightened person, you will do automatically. You'll do with so much ease that it looks like magic. And in fact, doing magic is being able to focus your will to get, in a lot of ways, what you want or what you crave or what you covet from the universe itself, from the dream in which we all reside. So, we often say to will things into being, and frequently mystical nomenclature today is to say, they'll say manifest, right? Manifest your dreams or manifest your reality, right? And what they mean is will. They're, will it into reality, will it into being. It matters when you're talking about a balanced society that the religious and the secular power only be 10% of the population, because that's not actually true about the way that civilizations balance themselves out. Because in fact, civilizations aren't balanced out. So like a good example, and one that fans of history and that people that I talk to tend to already know, is Akhenaten of Egypt. So Egypt is a difficult thing to talk about with any clarity because their history is something like 3,000 years long before Alexander showed up. And their civilization fell and was remade many, many, many times. The dynasties are something about which I am absolutely not fluent, but what is true about Egypt is that the power of the pharaoh in relation, or how do I want to say this? The power of the pharaoh in relationship with his priestly class waxed and waned over the thousands or over the centuries that Egypt was an idea. And so Akhenaten decided that as pharaoh and the most powerful person in the secular class, what he was going to do was he was going to take his acting role, and by that I mean role as an actor, as a stage performer in the cult ceremony, and he was going to effectively close down the cult and become also the head priest. And what happened to him is that he was killed, and pharaohs never quite regained the equal status that they had or shared with the priestly class before that. And so we also we in the West, we of European descent, should know that our history, the history of Christianity, of Christendom, is one of conflict between the powers, the expressed powers of the acting head of the secular state and the religious authority. So names like Thomas à Becket and Henry VIII should be obviously about this thing that I'm talking about. Henry VIII's marriage thing and the divorce thing and the Anglican Church thing, that was about dynasty, and that was about the relationship of the king to the church, whether the king should be the dominant power over the secular and the religious, or just the secular world. And the way that we understand things today is that the religious world shouldn't actually be considered a pillar of society at all. The way that we understand things today is that the media, i.e. entertainment, because we don't really have a leisurely media outside of people who are doing things not dissimilar from what I'm doing. Our media is entertainment. And when Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses, and therefore you take that pillar out of your society, and then you have the wildly unbalanced dualistic society of state and people, where the state is lying and saying that it isn't the 20% of the power that actually gets things done, but is actually part of the people, and that the state and the people, like the Father and the Son, are indistinguishable, is just a laughably absurd lie. And if you can't see through it, it's not your fault. But that does go to the question that I was asking before last time about extreme individualism, is at what point is it your fault that we are so, at what point is it my fault that I'm so naive and so ignorant? I don't know. I don't have an answer. I am of the opinion that it's always been my fault, ultimately, and that there is no magical age where suddenly you're given your backpack of your responsibilities. But I also went through my own psychosexual drama as a small boy, so, we all come to our conclusions our own ways. So we have the government and the media and the people as our trifecta, as the pillars of our society, and we say that the people should join a cult, and what we mean by that is that the people should entertain themselves. And what I broke off from with, if religion is the opiate of the masses, then what does that make entertainment? Is entertainment some other downer? Is it the marijuana of the people? Like what effect does Marvel movies have on you that's different from the effect that a passion play about Jesus has on you? I mean, we see churches try to reskin these Marvel characters in the Bible all the time. And what does it really say? I mean, asking the question, what does it say about our relationship with the religious, is stupid, because everybody is spiritual and not religious now. And the people who are religious because they had sinned so much that their lives were no longer theirs, and so they understood that they needed to give their life to something other than themselves, something bigger than themselves, and religion is most certainly bigger than you. But I don't know. I scoff at the idea of giving your life over to Jordan Peterson, but I definitely tried to give my life over to lesser teachers, lesser prophets, lesser cultists, and they didn't want me either. So what does that say about me is really the question. My favorite lyric from my favorite song. What's wrong with the world? Or what's wrong not with me? How's that damn? I'm so dumb. What's wrong not with the world but with me? So I keep losing this thread. I mean, I did sit down saying I didn't know what I wanted to talk. I just knew I wanted to talk. I wanted to do it again. I'm enjoying doing this. I suppose what I'm working myself toward is saying that being a cultist of Harry Potter, or loving reality television, or spending your time watching Jordan Peterson YouTube videos, or even watching people play video games and talk to themselves, no matter the quality of the actual video that they produce, these things are all, in their own way, human pursuits. And it's about how we frame our intention and what our will is. And so it's about goals, and it's about building something is what life is about. And so they ask, what's the meaning of life? And the meaning of life is to live, right? The meaning is to live. And so different civilizations, different cultures have a different expression of that. But the one thing that appears to me to be always true cross-culturally and throughout time is that the meaning of life is to have a story to tell at the end of it. Or for someone else to tell your story. This is why those very Vikings and early medieval Brits that I was talking about, and that I've spent so much time talking about, and even their Spanish and German and French and Polish and Austrian, and even their Magyar and Hungarian, and all of these people, all these Indo-European descendants, that's why they all are so obsessed, their leaders are so obsessed with songs being told about their lives. They don't have to be accurate. In fact, they don't even have to be original compositions. Just swap my name for the name of somebody who actually did something cool. Nobody remembers that guy, but please remember me, right? So life, I talked a lot about the cynical reasons to have kids, but the actual reasons that we have kids is to have someone to tell our story to, and to have someone that will tell our story, and have someone that will like the composition of the books of the Bible, like the composition of the Hebrew books of the Bible, someone who will add to and beautify and embetter and enliven and enlongen, that is a word, our story. So what we want is not to have Percival written about us. That isn't the meaning of life. What we want is to have the Volsung saga told about us. What we want is for our life to be the prologue of 7 generations of epic stories. And not doing that thing, having children for other reasons, not the cynical reasons to have children, those are individual sins. I don't think that means that we shouldn't also consider that parenthood and community are beautiful things. But I don't know how that fits into what I'm actually talking about. The meaning of life is that there is no meaning. what does that word mean? Meaning. What does it mean? What does mean? Well, what does his life mean? Well, you can only tell what a life meant by the end, and everyone has their own interpretation. If you take the postmodern neoliberal worldview and you extrapolate it out into the way that life is, every point of view is equally valid. And so again, that's a magical worldview that we're talking about. And what we're talking about is we're talking about that parable that the Buddha used when he was talking about this king who had a series or a collection of 6 blind wise men, effectively Brahmin. These 6 wise men, blinded wise men, describe an elephant by touching it, and each of them had a different part. And so if you haven't heard this, I'm not going to go down each part. You've already come to your conclusion that yeah, you can't describe an elephant by touching its tail. And then but the point of the story isn't that wise men are blind in their idiosyncratic approach to the universe, and it's not that kings are arbitrary, and it's not that bodhisattvas are particularly clever, all of which are true. It's that observing the behavior of blind but wise fools is instructive. Because if you can see the elephant, sure, you can laugh at them for their mistakes and what they're not getting right, but you can also learn from their mistakes, because you're not actually interacting with and engaging with the elephant. You can see the elephant, and sure, you can describe it, but you don't know what it feels like. You don't know it in a meaningful way. They do, in fact, know it in a more meaningful, and we're talking about deriving meaning, right? So there are levels of meaning, and we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about, the different kinds. I don't know that we've actually talked about the different kinds of knowing. We just talked about what knowing is. So, there's experiential knowing, and then there's hypothetical knowing, right? And so there's knowing something with certainty because somebody who's a good source told you and they had certainty. So like you can trust. There are whole other language traditions that qualify their words and their grammar based on whether what they're saying is good quality information or whether they heard it from a not quality source. This is highly pertinent to your life. This is highly pertinent human information to know whether somebody told you something because they knew it or because they heard it from a good source, because they personally experienced it. These different stages, these different kinds of knowing. And so when I talk about men magic, that father school of magic, what I'm talking about is people who are particularly interested in knowing what we know and how we know it, right? Because if you're preparing for death and for dying and then you're telling your story, you don't need to know what you know and what you know is valid. Because the kinds of things that you are engaging with, the kinds of things that you need to know whether they work, are the kinds of things that either work or they don't work, and you know immediately. So whether this particular thrust and this particular stance with this shield is going to protect your thrust with this spear and this particular stance with this shield is going to protect your life in a battle, you're going to find out pretty quick. You're going to find out real quick whether this bridge is going to hold up. You're going to find out. Like these things, but whether the weather, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is long cycles that require people to sit still and think about one thing for a long time. These are the kind of things that we're doing to test the reality of the dream. And so the people who are responsible, and I guess that, again, I'm talking about believing that institutions and the people that reside at the top of institutions, i.e. government, i.e. well, I do actually mean e.g. Government or our education systems, our CEOs of our major corporations, these things, that these people know what they're doing and have a long-term plan, and that they understand the future in a meaningful way. Our assumption of that from the 80% of people who are just people trying to live their lives, our assumption comes from that, from the time when the various schools actually did know what they were talking about and did have answers, in large part because the things that you could have answers to were so few. So what I'm saying is that, like, our old men, our wise men, our career politicians can't know how much power you actually have with a nuclear arsenal, or how much negotiation you actually get out of a trade embargo anymore. Like, the various outcomes to the political games of chess were pretty consistently the same forever, and they're not anymore. And so that kind of leads me to a sliding scale of ideologies, where it's like, at what point does your individualism impede on somebody else's desire to be a collectivist? And at what point does being a collective individual rip a person into too many personas, too many different personalities for them to keep track of? At what point are we inviting so many spirits and so many entities into our lives that we're no longer a person in any sort of meaningful way, but we are a collection of these dueling entities? So, like, at what point are we just defined by our addictions and our cults? And when does individual personality become meaningless? When you begin to engage, like, at what point of engagement with cult, and by that I mean entertainment media and politics, religion, yeah, those things. At what point does engaging with those things just make you not a person at all? It just makes you yet another person that engages with those things. I don't know the answer, and I don't know that it matters. I don't know that coming up with an answer matters, because, like, let's do a thought experiment. If you're a Republican, at what point does being a Republican mean that you have to be all of the particular things that being a Republican is, or you're not allowed to be a Republican anymore? And so at what point do you stop being you, who likes maybe Bud Light, and you are only acting like a Republican? And I know that that's a sort of existential dread for most people. Most people right now just live with this existential dread that they're torn in twain, not even in twain, they're torn in shreds and don't know who they are. And I don't know that I'm different, but I've never had a strong conception of who I am. Like, part of what made me like Zen, and part of why I enjoy doing this thing, even though it is exhausting and it's not easy, it's very difficult, is that I don't have a strong conception of self, and I've never had a strong ideation of a need for conception of self. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a self, right? That there's not this consistent through line of, like, oh yeah, this person has preference. But then that sort of opens up the door for another philosophical discussion, or an entire genre of discussion that I find people just, they're wrong when they talk about it. And it's what is self, right? What is the ego? What is that thing that humans have that's so different from other animals? That self-conception, right? Why do we have this tendency toward narcissism beyond just the survival instinct? Why do we have these big, powerful brains? Why am I able to do this? Other animals aren't able to do this. Other animals don't even have the compunction to do this. I'm not just able to do this. I have a compulsion. I have a desire. My day didn't feel like I was doing anything until I sat down to do this. And so one of the things that I noticed that psychological literature lacks is discussions on preference. Like, dislike. Where preference comes from. Because preference comes with plenty, right? So preference comes with options. So historians will talk about how medieval peasants would have preferred the fluffy white bread of the nobles, when in fact the gritty brown bread of the peasant, even though it was slowly grinding away their teeth and didn't taste good, had more nutrients in it and was better for them. They used that prefer. They would have preferred, or they did prefer. But what is preference? Preference is when you have options of two equally viable things you can prefer. So like, I can prefer that this not have onion in it, as an example, right? Well, you can only have the preference for something having onion in it if onion as such is an option. Is optional. God. I don't know exactly what that means for the purposes of our talk. Preference. Having a preference for something. But I do know that the Stoics, those Romans of that senatorial or the Republican period that we so highly regard, Stoics would have called preference soft. That having a preference is a sort of moral sin. So preferring that this not have onion in it is a sort of weakness. And from a politeness standpoint, having options and choosing to take the weaker one or the easier one, going the path of least resistance from a Stoic or a Republican or a classical Greco-Roman standpoint would have been decadence. Because immediately preceding what we understand or what we think of as the classical Greco-Roman period was extreme hardship. And so when I'm thinking about that Northern European extreme individualism, and I'm thinking about our modern division of responsibility, i.e. church, no, I said the one thing that I was trying to not say, i.e. state, people, and entertainment, I wonder where degradation fits into all of this stuff, into all of this conversation of what I'm talking about, and normalizing degradation. Because when degradation happened, so when a language died, for example, I've talked a big game about Hebrew being dead, but Latin died. And so when those languages died, the people that spoke them and that worked in them as librarians or as scribes, as clerics in general, they knew that their language was in decay. They knew that bad things were happening. And so when your civilization is ending, you're not unaware of it. It's like if I wanted to try to make the argument that our civilization died with 9/11, and I would like to make that argument frequently and not just from a place of trauma, because I don't know that it traumatized me. Because again, I thought that it was fake, and so I thought that all of our reactions in the aftermath were insane. The behavior of insane emotional reactionists, and instead of the kind of wise leaders that are advertised by our ideation of who is in charge and what happens when you institutionalize. And so when you're a part of a decaying institution, as I'm trying to say, you're aware that you're a part of a decaying institution. So if you listen to our politicians since 2001, it's very clear in the United States that our politicians are aware that our federal government, our civilization, not just our culture here in the United States, but this Western civilization is in turmoil. Not just in turmoil. I'm trying not to say what is truth, that we reside within an already dead corpse. And so I didn't finish that sentence. I didn't explain what that means. I was trying to go directly to the visual metaphor to help you see it. But what that means, living in the corpse of a dead civilization, is that this civilization is being stripped for parts. That's what I'm saying. And so I talked a lot, and I've been thinking a lot about whether I should have said it and whether I should have edited it out, or whether I should have done a whole episode, or whether I should still do a whole episode qualifying what I meant when I said that we have, for the last 50 years, minimum the last 50 years, and I keep calling it the Civil War, but I mean the Civil Rights Movement, but really it was a civil war. It was just a largely peacefully protested civil war, but it doesn't matter during the Civil Rights Movement, because it wasn't even largely peacefully protested. I just said that because it feels good to remember it that way. Ooh. I found a spot that makes my shoulder not hurt so bad. Give me a second. I'm sorry. What was I talking about the fucking civil right for again? Civil right. See that? Now I just can't say that without tripping up on it. Because I feel like I've been taught that my ancestors were on the wrong side of that conflict. But it required the entertainers. And it required, as I've said, it required white daughters. And so I brought up the Hollywood strikes. And I didn't really say anything about it. I just pointed out that I think it's silly that we think that Hollywood is responsible for accurately representing reality. But we're descendants of people who want to be remembered. And I understand now. I brought it up because I didn't have any conclusions. I just know that I'd been thinking about it, but I didn't know what I'd been thinking about it. And what I'm realizing is that we want our movies to be representative because we watching them understand that they're fictional. But what we want to pretend is that people in the future, especially when we tell our kids, is that this movie was in whatever way about us. That, oh, we were like this, or this captures what I was like, or this captured whatever. That the movie experience, the watching experience, because I have frequently accused people of not understanding what fiction does to the brain. But, so let's talk about it a little bit. So watching something, like watching a movie or watching a YouTube video, in large part why I suppose I'm not putting myself on the screen, is that watching something is, it's indistinguishable from having done the thing. So if you watch someone else do it, your brain reacts in exactly the same way as had you done it. I mean, that's how X-rated video works, right? Watching is the same. So fiction, imagining yourself having done a thing that you read in a book, isn't as powerful. Imagining yourself having done something that you heard in a song isn't as powerful as imagining yourself having done something that you just watched someone do in a movie, because the experiences are indistinguishable. You having done it or you having watched that person do it in that movie are exactly the same to your brain. And since in whatever way you are a sleeping dreamer, what happens to the experience of your brain is indistinguishable from the experiences that happen to you. Now, even though there's a you, which I suppose I started talking about, got tripped up on, didn't know what I was talking about anymore or why I brought it up and left. There's a you inside all of that collection of things that have happened to your brain. You're much less a pilot than the occupant of a VR headset experiencing a virtual reality. But that's not accurate. Like, that's not an accurate representation. So, like, dying isn't just rebooting like a computer game. So, like, life isn't a roguelite. Hey, we're talking about video games on a video game channel. I did it. I closed the gap for like 30 seconds. I love roguelites, but life isn't like that. Like, when you, like, that's why they have to go through so much work in the narrative of explaining how you're able to respawn. Because when you die, you don't just go to another reality and just pick up from, like, where that life was before you died in your reality. That's not what it's like. It's not what death is. How can I know what death is? I haven't died. I'm not sure that's true. I'm actually not sure that's true. Which is a strange thing to say, but material science wants to completely reject the near-death experience, and I see no reason to do that when the religious literature and mythology rely on it. So what have I been talking about? I don't really know. I'm certain that I haven't closed the gap on any of these things that I knew that I wanted to talk about, but I didn't know how to talk about them. I started talking about an illiberal democracy. So what, and I never asked the question, so what does it mean to be a democracy that's beholden or not free of the religious institution? Well, as outside observers and as allies contingent on their worldview lining up with ours, which is how that person that was interviewed explained why people care about what's going on in Israel. If their triangle is one of church, state, and people, not state, people, and entertainment, then they're taking the wrong drug. And if I have learned anything in my life as being a person who's not particularly interested in alcohol, but does have an affinity for marijuana and psychedelics, being fans of different drugs, being fans of different drugs can be the river that runs between you, that uncrossable barrier. There's a euphemism that I lost there for that. What I'm thinking about is I had a friend who was a master's in history who told me that he had come to the revelation that racism is just the people across the river from you, that it's really that simple, that it really just comes down to hating the people that are across the river from you. And so that's what I'm thinking about, is that thing that I said before is the river that runs between these people, this unbridgeable river. And of course, no river is unbridgeable. I mean, the Romans proved that. The Golden Gate Bridge, low-key, proves that, doesn't it? What was the thing that I said before, though? It seems silly to me. What I'm trying to say is it seems silly to me, or it seems naive to me, and I have a question to ask because of it, that the American people and then the American legislature, state, should be surprised that Israel should be, or should want to be, an illiberal democracy. And I keep approaching on it, but the question that I want to ask is, do we have opinions of it because we find ourselves as Imperial Rome looking at Israel in the same way that Imperial Rome looked at Israel at the birth of Christianity? Are we, in our decadence, realizing that we've put this entertainment media up as our religion, and our entertainment media is full of idiots that want to strike over nothing? This big demonstrative strike like people care, like the I have so many thoughts all happening at once, and none of them are verbal. Many of them are visual, but in a confused jumble that's almost impossible to articulate even to myself. But I'm trying to imagine like 15th century priests striking, like going on strike. Like, what thing does Hollywood do that it thinks is socially necessary that it can go on strike? And then like try to reach out to the common people to support it. Like, you're not coal miners, folks. But see, that goes to what I'm talking about when I'm asking, like, what not what right, what are we doing? What's actually happening when we're looking at Israel? Because another secret that you will learn if you take a religious path, if you join a cult, that's if you join a virtuous cult, what you will learn is not to compare yourself to other people. And so what that means is that the sinful state, or the default human state, is constantly comparing oneself to other people. And so if institutions are people, that means that institutions are constantly comparing themselves to other people. And so what that means is that there are lots of different responses to having compared yourself to another person, but one of the most common is to always compare other people unfavorably to yourself. It's if it's not the most common, it's the first. If there's a 5 stages of comparing yourself to someone, like there's a 5 stages of grief, that's one of them, right? Is comparing everything unfavorably to yourself, in a sort of self-protective narcissism. And a lot of people never grow out of that. They think that they're doing it in a positive way, which is strange. But another way is the inverse of that, is to always be comparing yourself negatively. So always to think of yourself in the negative as worse than the other thing. And there are good and bad reasons to do that. There are good outcomes from having done that, but there are typically bad outcomes that come from that, and that tends to be a complex post-traumatic stress disorder response. And it tends, from my observation, to be the result of having a devouring parent, specifically a devouring mother. Someone who has taught you to believe that you're worthless. so you compare yourself negatively to other people to reinforce that you're worthless or that you're never good enough. And so I wonder if our Christian conservative government doesn't do that to itself, because that's the Holy Spirit expression of Catholic and later Protestant Christianity is original sin, is that Manichaean sin that Saint Augustine introduced to the Christian worldview, this idea that there's an original sin that happened before the human species fully speciated from their ancestors that makes us all imperfect. And so any sort of good life or spiritual redemption is impossible. But that's a kind of pessimism that just needs to be immediately ignored. And thinking about it has got me so distracted, I literally have to back up. What was I talking about? Right, conservative self-hatred. So I wonder if this conservative self-hatred, because it's the conservatives who are interested in Israel. The liberals are pretty consistently negative toward Israel vis-a-vis the whole Palestine thing, and for good reason. So it's typically the conservatives, and it's typically, well, how do I want to put this? It's typically evangelical extremists, literalists, and apocalypticists who have an interest in what's going on in the city of Israel and with Israeli politics. And so the question that I have is, are they really surprised that Israel would want to be a theocracy, or are they comparing themselves to Israel and realizing, writ in big capital letters on the wall, so to speak, the decadence of their own people? Are they getting their own, I just forgot the words. I don't speak enough Hebrew to remember these, that I'm going to say these right. But are they being told that the end is nigh because we don't? In fact, we can't pivot to a theocracy. We can't, because there's no pivot. The government isn't in, or the religion isn't in the government. So we can't pivot to, well, what if we made decisions for religious reasons, or at least used religious backing behind our decision making, because we can't anymore, because the conservatives have lost that war for 50, or they've lost those battles for 50 years. You can't even be a Christian in public without getting scorned. I mean, it's safer to smoke in public than to be a Christian, than to pray. You will get more hateful looks, and you are more likely to be harassed by someone with green hair for praying in public out loud than for smoking. Which is sad. It's sad. It's funny to me because it's sad. So, do they care because it's a realization of what's lost? And is the entertainment elite shirking their responsibility to represent reality in a meaningful way with stories that have depth and that can mean something? Because because they are the secular elite who had already done that thing. And so, to me, the question of whether AI should be writing stories or should college graduates is easy. It doesn't matter. Neither of them knows anything about anything. I mean, I've already gone to great length to explain out how college graduates don't have enough life experience to tell stories. And if you listen to college graduates, they think that because they read one book, they know how to write a book. And it's like, no. The only people in the 1970s of that whole movement of remaking film who are still making film are the people who took the biggest risks in how you tell a story, not in what stories you tell, and not in how you film, but how you tell a story. Star Wars is George Lucas and Spielberg. But what they were interested in is how you tell it, not what you tell. They were telling mythic stories as old as time. And see, that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the oral versus the written tradition. So a movie, what I'm doing, these things are closer to sitting around a campfire and expressing the news than what a book is, than even what a newspaper is. So a newspaper tries to recreate the oral tradition. That's why newspapers are so toxic, and that's why journalistic integrity is such a moving goalpost, or it's if it were marked on a bar graph, it's so spiky. That's why it moves. It's constantly moving up and down, because the audience determines what goes when you're gossiping. And so that's why making news entertainment robs it of any sort of integrity. So like this whole argument going on now with Fox, and like, is Fox this or is Fox that? It's like, well, the question isn't whether Murdoch is a bad person and whether his corporations are evil. His corporations are making money. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. The question becomes, at what point naivete becomes ignorance, and at what point those things are harmful to the individual, and at what point it's the individual's responsibility to know what's fiction and what's not fiction. And so it becomes a question of what I was talking about when I introduced leisure into the conversation, and I've introduced sophistry without defining who sophists were, because I want to talk about Sophia, and I want to talk about wisdom, and it's hard to pin that down because wisdom traditions appear to be as varied and as variegated. I don't know what that even means, but they seem to be as widely varied as religions and as cultures and as civilizations themselves, but they're really not, because, as I'm saying, like, you can ask anyone, like, what's a rule for life? And the rules for life are always the same thing, like what things you need to do in order to get ahead. And they're like, have goals and be kind. It's like, okay, well, those aren't rules, right? Those are just self-evident. And so when I introduced the skeptics, and okay, well, what would the skeptics say? Well, the skeptics would modify that, and they would say, well, don't be ambitious. Have goals without being ambitious. And well, what does ambitious mean? And that's a difficult word to unpack, because it doesn't mean to us what it meant to the Romans who accused it of Julius Caesar, and who were right when they accused it of Julius Caesar. So ambition is the desire to be a god. So what a Stoic would say is, have goals, but set those goals below deity. So have a story, do things to be worth being remembered and worth telling your children, and worth your children telling their children, and be a paragon, be someone that other people will want to model themselves after, and will want their children, and will be okay with their children modeling themselves after. But don't aim yourself at deity, at immortality, at being the only model for people to go after. And that's why, if you pay attention, that's actually why Imperial Rome falls apart, is because the cult of the emperor makes being the emperor the only way to express oneself religiously. So the only people who are able to find any kind of redemption in their goals are the people who set their goals at emperor. Everybody else is just a slave to the emperor. And so that's sort of a liberality, right? That's sort of being the only way to be independent of the cult of the emperor is to be the emperor. Everyone else is a religious actor, a play actor. Everyone else is ritually performing to send the emperor to the good afterlife, but nobody else gets an afterlife. and all of the other cults become pointless and under the weight of the cult of the emperor. And that's specifically why Constantine chose Christianity in the ways really that he did. But this isn't about that. It's not really what I'm talking about. It is. Everything is. Everything is. So when you eat enough psychedelics, you realize that everything is the same. Everything is interconnected. And so that if I were to try to plot this out by just taking the thoughts that I've had, the topics that I've had, put them on a corkboard, I would very quickly look like that Charlie Day meme. And I would have no problem with that. But it would be hard to take me seriously if you saw this all plotted out on a grid, like if you actually did it. And it'd be pretty cool if somebody took me seriously enough to try someday. So do the conservatives want an illiberal democracy? And the answer is yes. You can't be a conservative and also want liberal democracy. Because what the conservatives want is, I did a lot of work to describe where liberalism comes from. Well, liberalism and conservatism, they broke apart at the same place. What the conservatives wanted was what the king wanted. So what the conservatives want is a theocracy, because the king was supposed to do what the Pope wanted. Not so much a hand-in-glove situation, but a what would Jesus do situation. And if you don't know, ask the Pope, and the Pope will tell you, and the Pope is Jesus. Effectively, there's no difference. When the Pope speaks, Jesus just spoke. Which makes having two living popes an interesting situation, because Jesus is no longer possessing Ratzinger, but Ratzinger is still alive. So why aren't we more interested in Ratzinger's post-Jesus? Why aren't we interested in his and how he exercised Jesus? Because his church, his Vatican, and the current Vatican are very interested in exorcising demons. So why aren't we interested in how he was able to exorcise being Jesus? I don't know. It's not what I'm talking about. I'll tell you that. It wasn't what I was talking about immediately preceding that either. Damn it. So the conservatives definitely want a theocracy. So I watched this documentary recently, and I got interested in the family. So the family is this cult, this Christian cult that works within the capital of the United States, and so it targets politicians, and it claims to be bipartisan, but I mean it really is basically just conservatives. But there are Christian liberals who participate. But the idea is that the family is sold as this Christian Illuminati, effectively making decisions at the highest levels of our government by emotionally and religiously manipulating our politicians, our decision makers. But really, it's more like what I was describing. It's a conservative replacer of the Pope with this non-denominational fundamentalist back to Jesus movement. So the family at its roots is an attempt to recreate first century Christianity, or even as late as 4th century Christianity. Really what it is it's an attempt to recreate the Christians who were able to religiously and emotionally manipulate Constantine into converting into Christianity. This is so many C words all in a row there. And I wasn't trying to be alliterative. And so, in a lot of ways, that is a theocracy, if you understand. It's a theocratic democracy. So in a lot of ways, conservative Christianity, no, I said that wrong. In a lot of ways, conservative politics in the United States is an attempt to return to a theocracy. So in a lot of ways, I wonder if our interests, and I don't so much wonder, I wonder whether I've demonstrated that the conservative interest in Israel and the conservative, it's not really so much a cognitive dissonance. It's like when you put, it's like when you put, it's like when you put two magnets together, but with the polarities matched, right? So they repel one another. The conservative Christian existence in American politics is that it's that repellent polarity magnetism situation going on with Israel. But I wonder to what end and what it really means, because it always means something. They wouldn't obsess over it if it didn't mean something to them. But I don't think that what they actually want is a return or a regression. I don't think that what they actually want is a return to like a papist trifecta. But I also don't think that they want to... What I'm saying is I don't think that they want to remarry the government, the state, and the religion. I don't think that what they want to do is undivorce those two pillars, separate them in the way that I mean, where the government, well, now I just said wrong, because what the separation of the church and state meant was that it wasn't that the church wasn't allowed to tell the state what to do. It was that the state wasn't allowed to tell the church that the state wasn't allowed to tell the church how to educate and administer to the people, contingent on the church giving the state good advice. That's what separation of church and state is. That's hard to say in one sentence without people's eyes glazing over, because it's complicated. Saying that separation of church and state means that the church isn't allowed to have opinions about what the state is doing is liberal manipulation of words. Because that's just not what separation of church and state is. Because church and state were always separate in that way. And as I've already demonstrated, the conflict between kings and the church is always about the church being subservient to the king, and the church saying, no, we're equal. You come to us for advice, and we tell your people to love you. And then separation of church and state says, no, you don't tell the people to love us, and we only come to you for advice. Because the immediate pre, the modern, and the immediate postmodern understanding of religion was emotional manipulation, And so that leads me with 18 minutes left to go before the 2-hour mark at a very good opening to talk about sophistry. Because what sophistry was whatever you needed to say or do to win an argument. That's what it comes down to. Now, sophistry is a lot of other things, but when we're talking about Athenian or Greek sophistry, when we're talking about what Plato was talking about when he was talking about sophists, we're talking about educated people who were orators and rhetoricians who traveled around Anatolian and Greek, traveled around continental, how do I even want to say this? Traveled around Greece, the islands of the Mediterranean, and Anatolia, because much of Turkey was culturally and ethnically Greek, right? So like this big Greece that we don't really think of as Greece, because they didn't think of it as Greece, like a big blue splotch on a map that all belonged to one culture, but they were one civilization and they were one people. They were one genetic pocket, effectively. It's unimportant when I'm talking about all of that, because what I'm trying to talk about is sophists, and who sophists was a particular class of educated orators and rhetoricians who were also tutors, and so they became famous because what they claimed is that they could teach your children the rhetorical, i.e. oratory skills necessary to win any argument, to become a perfect lawyer or become a perfect politician, and they were very good at it. They were so good at it that that's what the Republic is about. So I think, I can't find anyone to corroborate this, but I have read a lot of literature and I have listened to a lot of people talk. And I care deeply about this subject, and I think that sophistry, to be a sophist, comes from the same soph as the Sufi people. And I think that the reason that the Sufi people are tolerated but low-key hated among the Muslim people is because their worldview, their wisdom, actually has the antecedents and the ability to track itself back genetically in time that religions like Islam and Christianity, Judaism, and the neo-pagans claim to be able to do. I think that they actually are able to track their tradition that far back, because I think that the Safi that became the Sufi are the same people that were the Sophists. And what I mean by that is I think that the Sophists were originally, before they became a professional distinction, I think they were an ethnic distinction, and I think they were an ethnic minority of very, very, very capable wizards. And then, like the Chaldeans, their technology, that is their magical technology, their skill set, was stolen and became degraded to the point that now they're reduced to whirling dervishes. Because that's what degradation does to you. Once it happens, you know. Once it sets in, you know. You can't stop it. All you can do is prevent total death. And so I think that a lot of the reason that religion is so obsessed with leprosy is because leprosy in a lot of ways is analogous to the degradation of civilization. The parts fall off not only because they're decayed and dying, but also because the nerve damage that causes you to not know that you're bumping and banging and cutting and burning and killing the parts, the good flesh that cause you to not know that you're dying. And so even when you are aware that you have leprosy, you're not aware of the very specific maladies that you're going through. And I think that religion is obsessed with leprosy, not necessarily because there was any particular leprosy problem, but because leprosy is a good analogy for civilizational decay. And if religion is anything, it has a long memory. If religion has anything, it has a long memory, and it remembers all of the decay, all of the death, and all of the rebirth, because that's what life as a civilization is. You know, we individual cells, or we individual, you know, like if this is a body, we're just cells in it. So like you might be a kidney cell, and I might be a skin cell, and that person that you can see over there might be a hair cell. Who knows? But they all serve a purpose. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that I think that the postmodern worldview has forgotten that everybody does have a purpose, that whether there's a meaning, everyone has a purpose. Everyone can contribute in some way. And so by instilling this angst about meaning and about purpose and about not having a norn that whispers directly to you, and not having a direct relationship with God because you're spiritual, not religious, I think that these things are all black magic. I think that they're all put in you because they keep you still. And if you're still, If you're a prey animal, you're easier to pick off and eat. You're easier to sacrifice in the context of my first two metaphors. And so what Plato took umbrage with sophists and with sophistry wasn't necessarily that they were wrong. It was that they would say anything necessary to win. They wouldn't even say anything. They would say things that had absolutely no meaning and no bearing on the question at hand. If you were Socrates, the character in his plays about Socrates, and his dialogues using Socrates as a character, because effectively what he's trying to demonstrate, and what they and what I believe most people believe the religious do, is they would say, well, our answers and our way of life predates your answers and predates your way of life, so that we're able to come up with answers that stump your limited intelligence or your limited experience with arguing with somebody who wants to just tie you up in knots and not address the conversation or not address your question. We're right, and what we say is right. And if you've ever engaged with someone like that, you know that those people often are the most wrong about everything, right? And so the postmodern response was to go, okay, well, Christianity doesn't understand itself well enough to give its answers its whys. It can't give us whys to its things, so we're going to say we don't know the answers to the whys, and we're going to make our goal, our quest, we're going to make our spiritual raison d'etre, as it were, about finding that why. And so by doing so, they created this angst that's in everyone I've ever known, that there's no meaning to life, that you're supposed to find your own. If you don't find it by this arbitrary date, you haven't found it, and you never will. And this pressing, crushing need to be someone, right? But that's so absurd, and it's so harmful, and it's so hurtful. It has to be intentional. Someone has to benefit from it. So one of the ways I used to ask the question is, if the universe is a mill, and we souls are passed through that mill, and our suffering is milled for some sort of oil, is processed, if we are processed and our suffering is why we're here, who enjoys the bread and the oil? Is a question that I used to ask. And the implication that I used to leave to anyone who heard me ask the question was that it was God, or that it was angels and demons, or that it was this, or that it was that. But I ask the question sometimes in my mind just to remind myself that once I had a pretty quippy question. And I wonder, because nothing happens for no reason. Men didn't mine copper and tin and iron out of the ground for no reason. They did so because someone wanted it. Someone wanted it for some reason. And so other people went and got it for them. So if we are all suffering with this existential angst of who am I, what is my purpose, what is the meaning of life, who ordered it? And the answer, I mean, I've already said, we already know that there's a 0.01%, there's a 1% of 1%, 0.01% of people who make the decisions in the world. We've already talked about the Pareto principle, the Pareto relationship of, well, if there's suffering and if there's a product from that suffering to be made, 20% of the people benefit from 80% of the suffering, right? Isn't that how it goes? Something like that. And so what is the benefit? And so the obvious answer is to say, well, the benefit is to be rich. But I've already pointed out that if being rich itself were the benefit, then the rich wouldn't be trying to give up all of the responsibilities and everything that comes traditionally with being rich. They wouldn't be trying even to give up on the idea of a kingdom. Like, they've abandoned, like I ended last time by talking about how, Jesus talked about how a rich person couldn't get into the kingdom. Well, there were so many rich people who wanted into the kingdom after Jesus and after the first Gospels, that by the 3rd century of Christians, they basically had to say, no, rich people can get in just as easy. In fact, with simony, rich people get in much easier, because the doors, because of degradation, because of moral and ethical degradation, had become run by people who were willing and happy to be bribed. But the thing that we don't understand is that simony, those bribes, that money wasn't spent to enrich the personal lives of priests. Not before the 13th, 14th, not before the bubonic plague, not before the Catholic Church decided that it wanted to be a totalitarian government in its own right. But that didn't happen until basically the 16th century. That took basically 1600 years of institutionalized Christianity. And Christianity did not institutionalize, and so it didn't institutionalize in zero. So basically it took 1300 years of institutionalized Christianity, but that's besides the point. It's besides any point. Our rich have abandoned the idea of a kingdom altogether. Our rich exist in that that bubonic plague period of enjoy it while it lasts, because we're all going to die very imminently. Because our rich understand that the end is nigh. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. They understand that something's coming. Something bad is coming. The only, like I said, they're stripping it for parts. They're stripping this civilization, this culture for parts. Because if you remember the story of the ant and the grasshopper, only the people who have stored up resources are going to survive the winter, and winter is coming. Like, it's not going to be a zombie apocalypse, and let's hope for their sake that it's not an total economic collapse. They're expecting a population implosion, but they're expecting a population implosion because they're manufacturing a population implosion. If suddenly there aren't enough people to occupy a middle class, then the people with all the money duke it out over who gets to own everyone else that remains. I mean, it's exactly the dystopian nightmare that the 90s warned us about. And I'm at 2 minutes left before I wanted to be done. And that's cool, because I was wondering if I was going to be tired enough to do this. But that leads me thinking about what I've been thinking about. And that's assuming that our institutions and the people that are coming into our institutions all took the same lessons. So the reason that Christianity was able to get institutional ambitions of being a one world government is everyone believed the same things. Everyone all had the same ideas, and everyone all understood the same lessons. Okay? But not everyone who goes into movie writing, for instance, and not everyone who goes into coding for computers has watched Terminator, and not everyone who watched Terminator thought that the Skynet was a bad idea. Just because the author is telling you it's a bad idea doesn't mean that you interpret it as a bad idea. I mean, that is so self-evident. It makes me mad that I just said it, because if there being an answer, if there being an author who has a valid point, and then people just agreeing because he had a valid point and other people agreed that he had a valid point, we wouldn't have stopped being Catholic once people started reading the Bible. Once individuals and their extreme individual ideation started reading the Bible, and then the neo or the postmodern worldview was born, that every interpretation, I almost said interpolation, but I don't know what that means. Every interpretation of every work is equally valid, means that no two people interpret the Terminator movies the same. Agreeing means there's no money to be made on the discourse. And so institutions just ignore their institutional knowledge unless it's written in rules. And those rules, like I said, they're post hoc. They're made to prevent future devastating lawsuits. They're not put into place because they're best practice. Best practices, they change. If you've ever worked for a corporation, if you ever worked for McDonald's or Speedway or any corporation, you know that best practice changes every 6 months because the market is evolving. So maybe what I need to do is I need to spend until I sit down in front of my microphone thinking about the sliding scale of control versus freedom over people's lives. Because I think extreme individualism isn't so much libertarianism as it is being sovereign over everything that your campfire touches. And so that means that being a member of an HOA means that you are sovereign over the houses in your neighborhood, right? And so I think that extreme individuality comes with a compromise of almost an extreme submission to institution. So if I'm an extreme individual and my consequences are my own, then that means that you don't determine my consequences, but the aggregate of time and best practices, the best practices over the time, over the aggregate of time. Why is that so hard for me to say? As determined by an institution that the institution doesn't even always have to justify itself. But the institution is supposed to justify itself. And I suppose that that's where I'm at, is it's like, how can you compare yourself to a nation that doesn't have a constitution?